Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. The wealthiest man in the Roman Empire was dying. In a villa outside Rome on an April day in 65 CE, Lucius Annaeus Seneca sat surrounded by friends as blood slowly drained from open veins in his arms and legs. The man who had accumulated a fortune equivalent to hundreds of millions of modern dollars, who owned estates across the empire, who had served as advisor to the most powerful ruler in the known world, was choosing to leave it all behind. But this wasn't just any death. This was a performance, a final philosophical statement from a man who had spent decades teaching that true wealth had nothing to do with possessions. Here's what makes this moment devastating. For hours, as his life ebbed away, Seneca discussed philosophy with those gathered around him. When his veins wouldn't bleed fast enough, he drank hemlock, echoing the death of Socrates centuries before. When that failed to finish the job, he was carried to a steam bath, where he finally suffocated. Through it all, scribes recorded his words, though Tacitus, the historian who documented this scene, chose not to include them in his account. Perhaps because Seneca's final teachings had already been written. Perhaps because the contradiction was too perfect to spoil with more words. Because here's the thing that's haunted scholars for 2,000 years. Seneca, the philosopher who preached poverty, died extraordinarily rich. The man who wrote that true freedom comes from wanting nothing, had wanted everything the world could offer. He taught that we should be content with bread and water, while dining in villas decorated with rare marbles. He warned against the corrupting influence of wealth while lending money at such aggressive rates that it may have sparked a rebellion in Britain. And yet, his words on desire, on contentment, on the psychology of wanting, remain some of the most profound ever written on the subject. Was he a hypocrite? Obviously. Was he wrong? That's where it gets interesting. Because what if Seneca's contradiction wasn't a flaw in his philosophy, but the whole point? What if understanding true wealth requires first experiencing false wealth? What if you can only really know that you don't need something after you've had it? This is the paradox at the heart of Seneca's life and teachings. And before we dismiss him as just another rich man preaching to the poor, we need to understand something crucial about how he arrived at his most dangerous idea, that true wealth is having no desires. Let's go back to the beginning, to a young boy born around 4 years before the Common Era in Cordoba, Spain. The Roman province of Baetica was far from the center of power, but Seneca's family was wealthy and well-connected. His father, also named Seneca, had made a name for himself as a teacher of rhetoric in Rome. This wasn't just some provincial family scraping by. These were people with ambitions, people who understood that in the Roman Empire, success meant making your way to the capital, learning the right skills, knowing the right people. Young Seneca was sent to Rome for his education, and this is where the foundations were laid for everything that would follow. He studied rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, essential for anyone hoping to climb the ladder of Roman politics. But more importantly, he encountered Stoic philosophy. Now, Stoicism wasn't some abstract academic pursuit. It was the closest thing Rome had to a practical life philosophy, a system for actually living well in a chaotic, often brutal world. The Stoics taught something that would have seemed crazy to most Romans, that virtue was the only true good. Not power, not pleasure, not even life itself, but the quality of your choices, the integrity of your character. Everything else, they argued, was an indifferent. Wealth, health, reputation, these things were neither fundamentally good nor bad. What mattered was how you used them, how you related to them. A rich man could be miserable if he was enslaved by his possessions. A poor man could be free if he wanted for nothing beyond what nature required. But here's where young Seneca would have encountered the first contradiction, because while the Stoics preached indifference to wealth, they also acknowledged what they called preferred indifference. It was better, all else being equal, to be rich than poor, better to be healthy than sick. These things had value. They just didn't have moral value. They couldn't make you virtuous. And this subtle distinction would echo through Seneca's entire life. He would become wealthy, yes, but he would also spend decades trying to figure out what that wealth meant, how it affected him, whether he could be rich and virtuous simultaneously. His rise through Roman society was meteoric. By his 20s, Seneca had established himself as one of Rome's finest orators. He was brilliant, eloquent, dangerous in the way that smart people with words can be dangerous in political environments, and this brilliance nearly killed him. Under the Emperor Caligula, Seneca's rhetorical gifts attracted the wrong kind of attention. Caligula, paranoid and unstable, saw potential threats everywhere. A gifted speaker who could sway crowds was exactly the kind of person a tyrant needed to eliminate. Seneca survived, but just barely. And then, in 41 CE, under Claudius, the next emperor, he wasn't so lucky. He was accused of adultery with Julia Livilla, a member of the imperial family. Whether this was true or a political setup remains unclear. What's certain is that Seneca was exiled to Corsica, a backwater island, stripped of his property, separated from his friends and family, forced to live in conditions far beneath what he'd become accustomed to. 8 years. Seneca spent 8 years on that island. And here's where things get interesting, because he could have spent those years dwelling on what he'd lost, plotting revenge, becoming bitter. Instead, he wrote. He studied philosophy more deeply. He sent letters back to Rome, including to his mother Helvia, trying to console her for his absence. And in these writings, we see the first real development of his ideas about desire, about contentment, about the relationship between external circumstances and internal peace. He wrote to his mother, "You see how much pleasure poverty possesses. No one is in fear on account of himself. One feels as if he were in the most secure citadel that has been granted to mortals." This from a man who had been rich, who had known luxury, who had been forced into simplicity not by choice, but by political exile. He was testing his philosophy in real time, seeing if the ideas he'd absorbed about Stoicism actually worked when your circumstances collapsed. But then something remarkable happened. In 49 CE, everything changed again. Agrippina the Younger, who had married the Emperor Claudius, arranged for Seneca's recall from exile. Why? Because she had a son, a boy named Nero, and she needed someone to educate him, someone brilliant, someone who could teach this child to become emperor. Seneca, the exiled philosopher, the man who'd spent 8 years learning to be content with nothing, was suddenly handed an extraordinary opportunity. He became tutor to the future ruler of the Roman Empire. Think about what this meant. One day, you're on an island, scraping by, practicing poverty not as a philosophical exercise, but as your actual reality. The next, you're back in Rome. Not just back, but elevated higher than you'd ever been before, given access to wealth and power beyond anything you'd previously imagined. How does that not fundamentally alter your perspective on desire, on wanting, on the psychology of getting what you wished for? When Claudius died in 54 CE, poisoned most likely, and Nero ascended to the throne at just 16 years old, Seneca found himself in an even more powerful position. Along with Burrus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, Seneca effectively ran the Roman Empire for the first 5 years of Nero's reign. These years, often called the Quinquennium Neronis, are remembered as surprisingly good governance. Measured policy, clemency in legal matters, a certain restraint that Nero himself would later abandon entirely. But let's be clear about what was happening behind the scenes. Seneca was accumulating wealth at an extraordinary rate. He owned estates, villas, properties across the empire. Historical sources, admittedly hostile to Seneca in some cases, claimed he had amassed 300 million sesterces within just 4 years of Nero becoming emperor. To put that in perspective, this made him one of the wealthiest private citizens in Roman history, not through inheritance, not through conquest, but through his position of political power. And here's where the accusations of hypocrisy begin to have real weight. The historian Cassius Dio reported that Seneca forced massive loans on the British aristocracy after Rome's conquest of Britain, then called them in suddenly and aggressively. Some scholars argue this rapacious lending helped spark the Boudica uprising, one of the bloodiest rebellions against Roman rule. Whether this is entirely accurate or partly propaganda from Seneca's enemies, we can't know for certain. What we do know is that Seneca was incredibly wealthy, and that wealth came from his proximity to imperial power. So imagine being a contemporary Roman, hearing Seneca give speeches about virtue, about simplicity, about how true wealth comes from wanting nothing. You'd look at his marble floors, his Egyptian estates, his influence, and you'd think, this man is a fraud. He's telling us not to care about money while he swims in it. He's preaching contentment while he collects properties like other people collect coins. And you'd have a point. Except, what if Seneca knew exactly how it looked? What if the contradiction wasn't something he was blind to, but something he was acutely, painfully aware of every single day? Because here's what's fascinating about Seneca's writings from this period. They're not detached philosophical treatises from some sage sitting apart from the world. They're the desperate thoughts of a man caught in a trap, largely of his own making. In 62 CE, Burrus died. Suddenly, Seneca's political protection was cut in half. Nero was changing, becoming more erratic, more cruel, more unpredictable. The murders started. First Nero's own mother, Agrippina, the woman who had elevated both Nero and Seneca to their positions. Then Britannicus, Nero's stepbrother and potential rival. Then Octavia, Nero's wife, killed so he could marry his mistress. And Seneca, the great philosopher, the teacher of virtue, the man who had written an entire treatise on mercy, trying to guide Nero toward clemency. What did he do? He stayed. He wrote speeches justifying these murders. He used his rhetorical gifts to make the patricide sound reasonable, necessary, even virtuous. He didn't speak out. He didn't resign. He had become what the Stoics warned against, someone whose actions were controlled not by virtue, but by external circumstances, by fear, by attachment to his position and wealth. Twice Seneca tried to retire. In 62 CE, after Burrus died, he offered to return all his wealth to Nero and withdraw from public life. Nero refused. In 64 CE, Seneca tried again. Again, Nero said no, and Seneca complied. The man who taught that we should only want what is within our control, who wrote extensively about the importance of being free from fortune's whims, was trapped, not in a prison, but in the golden cage of his own success. And it's during these final years, knowing he was trapped, knowing Nero's paranoia was growing, knowing his death was probably inevitable, that Seneca wrote his most profound works. The letters to Lucilius, 124 philosophical epistles to a friend, were composed between 62 and 65 CE. The Natural Questions, an encyclopedia of natural phenomena, was written during the same period. These weren't the confident pronouncements of a man who had figured everything out. These were the reflections of someone grappling with the gap between philosophy and practice, between what he knew to be true and what he had actually lived. So when we read Seneca's words about desire, about wealth, about the foolishness of wanting more, we're not reading some abstract theory. We're reading confessions. We're reading a man trying to save himself through writing, trying to understand how he ended up here, trying to articulate truths he'd learned not from books, but from the painful experience of getting everything he thought he wanted and discovering it wasn't enough. Let's dive into what he actually wrote, because this is where it gets really interesting. In letter 16 to Lucilius, Seneca quotes Epicurus, his philosophical rival, saying something profound. If you live according to nature, you will never be poor. If you live according to opinion, you will never be rich. Think about that for a moment. According to nature versus according to opinion. What does that mean? Nature, Seneca argues, has very simple requirements: food, water, shelter, human connection. These things are necessary for life, and they have clear limits. You can only eat so much. You need a certain amount of water. You need protection from the elements. Once these natural needs are met, that's it. You're satisfied, complete, free. But opinion, the judgments and comparisons we make based on what society values, what other people have, what we've been told we should want, this has no limit. There's always someone richer, more successful, more admired. There's always another level to reach, another acquisition to make. And here's the cruel trick. The desires born from opinion are insatiable. They can never be fulfilled because they're not based on actual needs, but on relative comparisons. If wealth is about having more than others, then getting more wealth just moves the goalpost. Suddenly you're competing with different people who have even more than you do now. The game never ends. Seneca observed this not as an outsider, but as someone living it. He'd climbed from provincial wealth to imperial wealth, and at each level, the same pattern repeated. Getting what he wanted didn't bring satisfaction. It brought new wants. In letter 15, he quotes Epicurus again. The fool's life is empty of gratitude and full of fears. Its course lies wholly toward the future. Then Seneca adds his own reflection. We are plunged by our desires into ventures which will harm us, but certainly will never satisfy us. For if we could be satisfied with anything, we should have been satisfied long ago. Nor do we reflect how pleasant it is to demand nothing, how noble it is to be contented, and not to be dependent upon fortune. This is devastating when you think about who's writing it. A man who has lived the alternative, who has demanded everything, who has been utterly dependent on fortune, on the whims of emperors, on political circumstances. He's not theorizing. He's reporting from the front lines. He continues in the same letter. Whoever does not regard what he has as most ample wealth is unhappy, though he be master of the whole world. Master of the whole world, and still unhappy. This wasn't abstract for Seneca. He'd seen it up close in the emperors he'd served. Claudius, poisoned in his own palace. Caligula, assassinated by his own guards. And now Nero, spiraling into paranoid madness despite having absolute power. The pattern was undeniable. External wealth and power don't bring peace. Often they bring the opposite. But Seneca goes deeper than just observing that desire is problematic. He analyzes the psychology of it, dissects how it actually works in the human mind. In another letter, He uses the metaphor of the belly. He notes that the belly, our hunger, represents our most basic natural desire. And even this, the most legitimate of needs, becomes tyrannical if we're not careful. The belly will not listen to advice, he writes. It makes demands, it importunes, and yet it is not a troublesome creditor. You can send it away at small cost, provided only that you give it what you owe, not merely all you are able to give. Think about what he's saying here. Even with legitimate needs, there's a distinction between what you owe and what you're able to give. Hunger can be satisfied with simple food, but if you're wealthy, you can give your belly much more than it needs. Luxury meals, exotic ingredients, endless variety. The need is satisfied, but the want continues. And if this is true for our most basic biological need, imagine how much more it applies to our social desires. The desire for status, for admiration, for security, for more. These desires have no built-in satisfaction point. They're based on comparison, on opinion, on the endless game of wanting what we don't have. Seneca makes a crucial distinction that's often missed. He's not advocating for actual poverty. He's not saying everyone should live on the streets with nothing. Remember, he himself didn't do this. What he's arguing for is psychological independence from wealth, freedom from needing it, the ability to be okay whether you have it or not. This is why he recommends something that sounds crazy at first: rehearsing poverty. In letter 18, he lays out a practice that would have scandalized his wealthy Roman peers. Set aside a certain number of days during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, "Is this the condition that I feared?" He's specific about this. 3 or 4 days at a time, sometimes more. Hard bread, cheap food, rough clothing. Sleep on a simple pallet, not your luxurious bed. Experience what it's like to have nothing. Now, on the surface, this seems absurd coming from a man with multiple estates. But look at what he's actually trying to do. He's building immunity to fear. Because here's the thing about wealth. The more you have to lose. And the fear of losing it becomes its own prison. You start making choices not based on what's virtuous or right, but based on protecting what you have. You become enslaved by your possessions. By periodically experiencing poverty, Seneca argues, you prove to yourself that you can survive it. More than survive, you might even find a certain joy in it. You will leap for joy when filled with a pennyworth of food, he writes, and you will understand that a man's peace of mind does not depend upon fortune. For even when angry, she grants enough for our needs. This practice serves multiple purposes. First, it reduces fear. If you know you can live on bread and water, you're less afraid of losing your wealth. Second, it creates gratitude. When you return to your normal life, everything seems abundant by comparison. That wine you barely noticed before, now it's a gift. That comfortable bed, pure luxury. Third, it tests your philosophy. Are you really indifferent to wealth? Or is that just something you tell yourself? And here's where Seneca's personal experience becomes relevant. Remember, he'd been exiled. He'd spent 8 years stripped of his wealth and position. He knew what it was like to fall from comfort into discomfort. When he recommends practicing poverty, he's not asking others to do something he hasn't experienced. He's saying, I've been there. I've lived through the thing you fear, and I'm telling you, it's not as bad as you think. In fact, learning that you can survive it, that you can even find peace in it, is one of the most liberating discoveries you can make. But did he practice this while wealthy? Did he spend days on hard bread and rough clothing while owning estates across the empire? We don't know for certain. Some scholars argue he must have, that his writing is too specific, too detailed to be purely hypothetical. Others say this just proves his hypocrisy. He preached what he didn't practice. But maybe there's a third option. Maybe he practiced it while exiled, internalized the lesson, and spent the rest of his life trying to hold on to that wisdom even as circumstances changed. Because here's what's clear from his letters. He knew the trap he was in. In letter 20, he writes to Lucilius, "I ask and beg of you, on your part, that you let wisdom sink into your soul, and test your progress not by mere speech or writings, but by stoutness of heart and decrease of desire. Prove your words by your deeds." He's asking his friend to do what he himself struggled with, actually living the philosophy, not just writing about it. Then he adds something remarkably self-aware. If you wish to have leisure for your mind, either be a poor man or resemble a poor man. Resemble a poor man, not be poor, but behave as if you were. Live simply, want little. This distinction is important because it acknowledges reality. Seneca couldn't just give away all his wealth and retire to a simple life. He was trapped in his position. But what he could do, what he was trying to do, was maintain the mindset of someone who didn't need that wealth. The distinction between having and needing is absolutely central to Seneca's philosophy. You can have wealth without needing it. You can use resources without being enslaved by them. But this requires constant vigilance, constant self-examination, because the gravitational pull of desire is always there, always trying to convince you that what you have isn't enough. In letter 14, Seneca writes something that cuts right to the heart of this. He who needs riches least enjoys riches most. He who craves riches feels fear on their account. No man, however, enjoys a blessing that brings anxiety. He's always trying to add a little more. This is the paradox of wealth. The more you need it, the less you can enjoy it, because you're always afraid of losing it, always wanting more of it. Only when you don't need it can you actually appreciate it for what it is. A tool, a resource, not a source of happiness. He continues, while he puzzles over increasing his wealth, he forgets how to use it. He collects his accounts. He wears out the pavement in the forum. He turns over his ledger. In short, he ceases to be master and becomes a steward. This image is perfect. The rich man who is so busy managing, protecting, and growing his wealth that he becomes its servant rather than its master. His days are consumed not by living, but by maintaining the system that's supposed to enable his life. And Seneca knew this pattern intimately. As one of Nero's chief advisors, his days were filled with exactly this kind of management. Property decisions, loan calculations, political maneuvering to protect his position. The wealth that was supposed to buy freedom had created a complex web of obligations and fears. The more he accumulated, the more there was to lose. The more carefully he had to navigate political dangers. So when he writes to Lucilius, encouraging his friend to avoid this trap, there's a note of warning born from experience. Don't become what I became. Don't let the pursuit of wealth consume the time that wealth was supposed to buy. Because here's the cruel irony. What most people want from wealth is leisure, time to pursue what actually matters, freedom from having to constantly work. But accumulating wealth requires exactly the opposite. Constant attention, constant effort, constant anxiety about maintaining and growing it. Seneca understood that time was the most precious resource, far more valuable than money. In his essay on the shortness of life, he writes, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. Life is long enough, and a sufficiently generous amount has been given to us for the highest achievements if it were all well invested. But how do we invest our time? Most of us, he observed, spend it chasing things that don't matter, accumulating things that don't fulfill us, worrying about things we can't control. This brings us to one of the core Stoic distinctions that Seneca tried to live by, the dichotomy of control. What is actually within your power and what isn't? You control your judgments, your responses, your choices. You don't control external events, other people's actions, or fortune's whims. Wealth falls into that second category. You might work for it, plan for it, make smart decisions about it. But ultimately, whether you get it or keep it isn't entirely up to you. Circumstances can change, markets can crash, emperors can exile you. So if happiness depends on having wealth, you've made your peace of mind dependent on something outside your control. You've enslaved yourself to fortune. This was the key insight that Seneca kept circling back to. True freedom, real wealth, comes from wanting only what is within your power to guarantee. And the only thing you can truly guarantee is your own virtue, your own choices about how to respond to circumstances. But here's where theory crashes into reality. Because while you can't control whether you get wealthy, you can control whether you pursue wealth. And Seneca pursued it. Aggressively, successfully. This wasn't passive accumulation. This was active engagement in the game he was philosophically criticizing. So what do we do with that? Some argue Seneca was simply practicing what Stoics called preferred indifference. Yes, wealth is ultimately neutral, morally speaking. But given the choice between being rich and poor, all else equal, it's reasonable to prefer being rich. A Stoic can work to acquire wealth as long as they're prepared to lose it, as long as they're not making immoral choices to get it, as long as they're not attached to it. By this standard, Seneca's wealth accumulation was philosophically defensible. He preferred being rich, worked toward it, but also maintained that it wasn't what truly mattered. Others argue this is sophistry, clever rationalization for behavior that contradicts his teachings. They point to the aggressive lending, the political compromises, the speeches justifying Nero's crimes. These weren't the actions of someone indifferent to wealth and power. These were the actions of someone desperately protecting what they'd gained, making moral compromises to maintain their position. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Seneca was human, brilliantly insightful about the psychology of desire, yet still subject to it. He could see the trap clearly even while caught in it. And maybe that's what makes his writings so powerful. They're not coming from someone who transcended desire and spoke down from some enlightened mountaintop. They're coming from someone in the thick of it, wrestling with it daily, trying to figure out how to maintain integrity while navigating an impossibly complex situation. And that situation was getting worse. Because Nero wasn't just erratic anymore, he was dangerous. After the fire that destroyed much of Rome in 64 CE, Nero blamed the Christians and launched a brutal persecution. He'd already murdered his mother, his wife, his stepbrother. The list of dead kept growing. And Seneca, the philosopher of virtue, remained in Nero's court, still technically his advisor, even as his influence waned. We can imagine what those final years were like for Seneca, knowing death was coming, unable to prevent it, trying to use what time remained to write down everything he'd learned. The letters to Lucilius take on a different tone when you read them this way, not as detached philosophical teachings, but as urgent messages from someone who knows his time is limited. Write now, while you can. Read now. Learn now. Don't waste time on things that don't matter. Don't pursue desires that can't be satisfied. Find what's within your control and master that. Let everything else go. In one particularly poignant letter, Letter 1 on saving time, Seneca writes, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." He's writing to someone younger, someone who still has time, and he's basically screaming, don't make my mistakes. Don't spend your life chasing things that won't matter when you're facing death, because that's the ultimate test of what truly matters. When your own mortality is undeniable, when you're being forced to choose death, what remains valuable? For Seneca, the answer was clear in theory. Only virtue. Only the quality of your choices and character. Everything external, all the wealth, all the status, all the accumulated possessions, these become meaningless. You can't take them with you. They can't protect you. In the end, all you have is how you face the inevitable. But knowing this intellectually and living it are different things. Seneca knew the theory perfectly. Living it, that was harder. And then came April 65 CE. A conspiracy to assassinate Nero, led by Gaius Calpurnius Piso, was discovered. Multiple members of the Roman elite were implicated. When Nero's paranoia turned towards Seneca, whether he was actually part of the plot or not became irrelevant. The emperor wanted him dead. The order came, take your own life. This was actually a form of mercy in Roman culture. Senators and other high-status individuals were typically given the option to commit suicide rather than being publicly executed. It allowed them to die with some dignity, to control the manner and circumstances of their death. And for someone like Seneca, who had spent years writing about facing death without fear, this was the ultimate test. He was at his villa when the soldiers arrived with Nero's order. At 69 years old, his health already failing, Seneca received the news calmly, according to Tacitus. He called for his will, wanting to leave something to his friends. The officer refused to allow it. So Seneca turned to those gathered and said, according to the account, that he would bequeath to them the pattern of his life, his example. If they remembered it, they would win a name for moral worth and steadfast friendship. Then he turned to his wife, Pompeia Paulina, who declared she would die with him. Sources suggest Seneca might have tried to dissuade her, or perhaps he agreed. They opened their veins together, the traditional Roman method of suicide. But Seneca's blood flowed slowly. At 69, perhaps already weakened, his veins wouldn't bleed properly. Hours passed. Think about what this meant. This was supposed to be a dignified, relatively quick death. Instead, it became prolonged, agonizing. Seneca, the philosopher who had written so eloquently about facing death with calm acceptance, was instead experiencing a drawn-out, painful process. He had his servants open additional veins in his legs. Still, death wouldn't come. At some point, Pompeia was taken away. Nero, apparently, decided one death was enough and ordered physicians to stop her bleeding. She survived, living on with scars on her arms as a permanent reminder. Meanwhile, Seneca's ordeal continued. He asked for poison, specifically hemlock, the same poison that had killed Socrates. This was deliberate symbolism, Seneca modeling his death on the greatest philosophical death in history. But even the hemlock didn't work quickly. His body, already weakened, couldn't absorb the poison efficiently. Finally, desperately, he was carried to a steam bath, where the heat would speed his blood flow and the steam would suffocate him. And there, in that steam bath, after hours of suffering, Seneca finally died. Tacitus tells us that he spent those final hours discussing philosophy with friends who were present, that he remained composed, that he faced the end as a Stoic should. What exactly he said, Tacitus chose not to record, noting that Seneca's public works had already established his views. But we can imagine what he might have said, because he'd already written it down. In his essays and letters, Seneca had prepared for this moment countless times. "Rehearse death," he'd written. To say this is to tell a person to rehearse his freedom. A person who has learned to die has unlearned how to be a slave. Death, in Stoic philosophy, wasn't something to fear, but something to prepare for, even embrace, as the ultimate expression of freedom. No tyrant can truly harm you if you don't fear death. No fortune can control you if you're willing to let everything go, including life itself. In another letter, he'd written, "Disaster is virtue's opportunity." Even in his own death, he was trying to transform it into something meaningful, a final demonstration of philosophical principles. Like Socrates before him, he was teaching up to the very end. While you can kill me, you cannot harm me. You cannot touch what truly matters. My character, my choices in these final moments, my dignity in the face of death. But was it actually dignified? The prolonged suffering, the multiple failed attempts, the final desperate resort to suffocation in a steam bath, this doesn't sound like the serene philosophical death we imagine. It sounds messy, painful, human. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Seneca's death, like his life, was a mix of philosophical aspiration and messy reality. He tried to die well, to face it bravely, to make it meaningful. But he also suffered. He struggled. The ideal and the actual once again diverged. In the centuries after his death, artists have depicted Seneca's suicide in countless paintings. Peter Paul Rubens, Jacques-Louis David, and others created dramatic scenes of a composed philosopher calmly discussing virtue while bleeding to death, surrounded by grieving but attentive students. These paintings show the ideal, the Stoic sage facing death without fear, teaching until the end, demonstrating perfect virtue. They're beautiful, inspiring, and probably not quite accurate. The real Seneca's death was likely more chaotic, more painful, more desperately human. And that makes it, in some ways, more meaningful. Because perfect Stoic sages might not fear death, but actual humans do. Real people struggle. The gap between philosophical ideal and lived reality is where most of us exist. And Seneca, for all his wealth and wisdom, existed there too. So what are we left with? A rich man who preached poverty and died in between. A philosopher who couldn't fully live his philosophy but spent his life trying. A teacher whose most important lesson might be the human struggle to bridge the gap between knowing what's right and actually doing it. Does that make him a hypocrite? Yes, in the technical sense. His actions didn't perfectly align with his words. But does that make his words less true? Does it make his insights about desire, wealth, and freedom less valuable? Here's what I think. Seneca's contradiction is valuable precisely because it's so human. We've all experienced the gap between knowing what we should do and actually doing it. We've all understood something intellectually while failing to live it practically. We've all been trapped by desires we know aren't good for us. Wants that don't serve us, habits that contradict our stated values. In this, Seneca isn't exceptional. He's painfully relatable. But what he did was exceptional. He took that common human struggle and examined it with incredible precision. He articulated the psychology of wanting, the nature of desire, the relationship between external wealth and internal peace better than almost anyone before or since. And he did this not from some abstract theoretical position, but from deep in the trenches, struggling with it himself. When he writes that we're plunged by our desires into ventures which will harm us, but certainly never satisfy us, he's not guessing. he's reporting. When he observes that if we could be satisfied with anything, we should have been satisfied long ago. He's describing his own experience of getting everything he thought he wanted and discovering it wasn't enough. When he warns that wealth can become a burden that enslaves rather than liberates, he's speaking from the cage he'd built for himself. This is why his writings have survived and remained relevant for 2,000 years. Not because he perfectly embodied his philosophy, but because he struggled with it so honestly. His letters to Lucilius aren't the confident pronouncements of a sage who's figured everything out. They're the urgent, sometimes desperate attempts of someone who sees the truth clearly, but can't always live it, trying to help his friend avoid the same traps. And the truth he kept circling back to, the core insight that threads through all his writings, is this: true wealth is having no desires. Not no things, no desires. The freedom that comes from wanting nothing beyond what is within your control, beyond what nature actually requires, beyond what virtue demands. This is the wealth that can't be taken from you, the wealth that grows the less you need, the wealth that paradoxically comes from letting everything else go. But he also understood something crucial. This isn't easy. It's not a switch you flip. It's not something you achieve once and then maintain effortlessly. It's a constant practice, a daily discipline, a continuous choosing. You have to rehearse it. You have to practice it. You have to test yourself against it again and again. And even then, you'll fail sometimes. You'll get caught up in wanting. You'll make compromises. You'll choose comfort over virtue, security over freedom. The question isn't whether you'll struggle with desire. The question is whether you'll keep trying to master it, whether you'll keep examining your wants, questioning your needs, testing whether your peace of mind really depends on the things you think it does, whether you'll maintain the practice of voluntary discomfort, the discipline of gratitude, the constant self-examination that asks, am I enslaved by what I own? Do I need this? Would I be okay without it? This is where Seneca's practice recommendations become so important. The specific exercises he lays out aren't about achieving some perfect state of desirelessness. They're about building resilience, about training yourself to be okay with less, about proving to yourself again and again that you're more robust than you think. 3 days on bread and water doesn't make you indifferent to wealth, but it does reduce your fear of poverty. It shows you that the thing you're afraid of isn't as bad as you imagined, and that reduced fear creates space for freedom. Imagine actually doing this. You set aside a few days. You eat simple food, wear simple clothes, sleep on something uncomfortable. At first it's hard. You notice every deprivation. You want your coffee, your comfortable bed, your usual comforts. But as the days pass, something shifts. You realize you're surviving. More than surviving, you're okay. The fear lessens, and when you return to your normal life, everything feels abundant. That wine you barely noticed before, pure luxury now. That comfortable bed, a gift. The variety of food choices, overwhelming wealth. You haven't changed your actual circumstances, but you've changed your relationship to them. You've reset the baseline of what feels like enough. And in doing so, you've gained a kind of freedom that having more wealth could never provide. The freedom that comes from being content with what you have. This is what Seneca meant by resembling a poor man while being rich. It's not about pretending you don't have resources. It's about maintaining the mindset of someone who doesn't need them, who could lose them tomorrow and be okay. It's about using wealth as a tool while not being used by it. And the only way to develop this mindset is through practice, through repeatedly putting yourself in situations where you don't have what you're used to having. But let's be honest about how difficult this is in practice. We live in a world that's specifically designed to create and amplify desires. Every advertisement is an attempt to make you dissatisfied with what you have, to convince you that happiness is just one purchase away. Every social media feed is a comparison engine, showing you people with more, better, newer things. The entire economic system depends on people wanting more, buying more, never being satisfied. Seneca identified this problem 2,000 years ago when he talked about the tyranny of opinion versus the simplicity of nature. Opinion, in his context, meant social expectations, cultural values, what everyone around you thinks you should want. And that tyranny has only gotten worse with modern technology. We're not just comparing ourselves to our immediate community anymore. We're comparing ourselves to the entire world, to curated highlight reels, to people we'll never meet, but whose apparent success makes our own lives feel inadequate. This is why Seneca's idea feels almost subversive today, almost dangerous. What would happen to our economy if people actually internalized the message that true wealth is wanting nothing? If consumers stopped consuming beyond their needs? If people found contentment in simplicity? The entire system would have to fundamentally restructure. And maybe that's exactly why we need this wisdom now more than ever. Because the endless growth model, the constant consumption, the never-ending pursuit of more, this isn't just personally exhausting. It's environmentally unsustainable. It's creating levels of debt, anxiety, and dissatisfaction that our ancestors could never have imagined. We're wealthier than any previous generation in material terms, yet studies show we're not happier. In many cases, we're more anxious, more depressed, more disconnected. Seneca would recognize this pattern immediately. We've made the same mistake he did, just collectively. We've pursued wealth thinking it would bring freedom and peace, only to discover it brings new anxieties, new obligations, new fears of loss. We've achieved unprecedented material abundance, but lost the ability to be satisfied with it. We always want more, better, newer, because the desire isn't really about the things themselves. It's about the psychological satisfaction we think they'll provide. And that satisfaction never comes, because it was never in the objects to begin with. This brings us back to the fundamental psychological insight at the heart of Seneca's philosophy. Desire is insatiable because it's based on a false premise. We think we want things when what we actually want is the feeling we believe those things will provide. Security, happiness, peace, freedom, status, significance, these are what we're actually after. But we've been taught to pursue them through external accumulation, through having more. And external accumulation can never satisfy internal needs. You can see this pattern play out across different income levels. Studies have shown that beyond a certain threshold where basic needs are met, more money doesn't correlate with more happiness. The jump from poverty to middle class makes a huge difference in well-being. The jump from middle class to wealthy makes very little difference. The jump from wealthy to extremely wealthy might even make things worse, because now you have more to protect, more to fear losing, more complexity to manage. Seneca saw this firsthand in the Roman elite. The wealthiest people in the empire were often the most anxious, the most paranoid, the most trapped by their circumstances. They had everything the world could offer, yet they couldn't enjoy it because they were constantly afraid of losing it, constantly maneuvering to protect and expand it, constantly aware that their wealth made them targets. This is why he kept emphasizing the practice of poverty, the rehearsal of loss, because the fear of losing wealth is often worse than the actual loss. The anxiety about what might happen drains more joy from life than the thing you're afraid of would, if it actually occurred. By practicing loss, by putting yourself in the condition you fear, You prove to yourself that you can handle it, and that proof is liberating. But there's a deeper level to this. Seneca wasn't just talking about financial poverty. He was talking about the poverty of desire itself, the state of wanting nothing. And this is where his philosophy gets really radical. Because what would it mean to truly want nothing? Not to suppress desires or deny them, but to actually reach a state where you're complete, satisfied, not lacking anything. This sounds impossible at first. Isn't desire fundamental to being human? Isn't wanting things, striving for things, what motivates us to get out of bed in the morning? If we truly wanted nothing, wouldn't we just sit still and do nothing? Seneca anticipated this objection and addressed it in his distinction between natural and unnatural desires. Natural desires, he argued, are those that arise from actual needs. Hunger, thirst, warmth, safety, human connection. These are built into us by nature. They have clear satisfaction points. When you're hungry, food satisfies that hunger. When you're cold, warmth satisfies that need. These desires don't spiral out of control because they have natural limits built in. You can only eat so much, sleep so much, need so much warmth. Unnatural desires, on the other hand, are those created by opinion, by social comparison, by imagination. The desire for luxury beyond comfort, for wealth beyond sufficiency, for status and fame and power. These have no natural limits. They're based on comparison and imagination, so they can always expand. There's always more status to achieve, more wealth to accumulate, more luxury to experience. The terminus, the natural stopping point, doesn't exist. So when Seneca talks about having no desires, he doesn't mean eliminating natural needs. He means eliminating the unnatural wants that can never be satisfied. Eat when you're hungry, by all means, but don't develop elaborate desires for gourmet experiences that go far beyond nutrition or even enjoyment. Sleep when you're tired, but don't obsess over having the perfect mattress, the perfect room temperature, the perfect sleep routine. Meet your needs simply and move on. This creates a profound psychological shift. Instead of your life being driven by an endless series of wants, it becomes driven by something else. By curiosity, maybe. By genuine interest in ideas and people and experiences. By meaningful work. By relationships. By the natural unfolding of your existence without the constant distraction of unfulfilled desires pulling you toward an imagined future where you'll finally have enough. Seneca understood that most of our stress comes from this orientation toward the future, toward the things we don't yet have, but think we need. In letter 15, he writes about how the fool's life lies wholly toward the future. Always planning, always preparing, always working toward some future state where things will be better, where we'll have what we need to finally be happy. But that future never arrives, because when we get what we thought we needed, we just generate new wants. The wise person, by contrast, is content in the present, not because their circumstances are perfect, but because they've learned to want nothing beyond what they have. This doesn't mean passive acceptance of bad situations. It means not making your peace of mind dependent on changing external circumstances. It means being okay now, with what is, while also working toward worthy goals, not because you need them to be happy, but because they're worth pursuing. This is a subtle but crucial distinction. The Stoics weren't fatalists. They didn't say you should never try to improve your situation. They said you should base your happiness on things within your control, your virtue, your choices, your character, and treat improvements in external circumstances as preferred but not necessary. Work toward goals, but don't make your contentment dependent on achieving them. For Seneca, the ultimate test of this philosophy came in his final years. When he tried to retire and Nero refused, when he watched the emperor he tried to guide become a monster, when he knew death was coming, could he maintain this equanimity? Could he truly be okay with losing everything, including his life? The evidence suggests he struggled with it, that he wasn't perfectly serene, but he tried. He kept writing, kept teaching, kept practicing the philosophy he developed. And when the order finally came to die, he faced it with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. He couldn't control how he died, the prolonged suffering, the failed attempts, the messy reality, but he could control how he responded to it. And by all accounts, he didn't beg for his life, didn't offer bribes, didn't compromise his philosophical principles in the final moments. He accepted what was coming and tried to make it meaningful. This is the practical application of having no desires. When you truly don't need things to turn out a certain way, when you're prepared for any outcome, when your peace of mind doesn't depend on circumstances, you can face anything with equanimity. Death becomes just another change in circumstances, significant but not ultimately threatening to what matters, your character, your virtue, your integrity. For those of us not facing death sentences, the application is less dramatic but equally relevant. What would it mean to go through a day wanting nothing? To be completely satisfied with whatever arises? To not hope for specific outcomes, but be okay with any outcome? Most of us can't imagine it because we're so conditioned to constant wanting. We wake up wanting coffee, wanting the day to go a certain way, wanting specific things to happen, wanting to avoid other things. All day long, we're pulled by desires toward imagined futures and pushed by aversions away from imagined problems. But imagine the freedom if you could let all that go. Not the planning, not the working toward goals, but the emotional dependence on outcomes. You'd still do your best at work, but you wouldn't be stressed about the results. You'd still pursue health, but you wouldn't be anxious about illness. You'd still value relationships, but you wouldn't be desperate for specific responses from people. You'd engage fully with life while being okay with however it unfolds. This is what Seneca meant by freedom. Not freedom from circumstances, but freedom within any circumstances. The slave who wants nothing is freer than the emperor who wants everything, because the slave's peace of mind doesn't depend on anything external. The emperor, despite his power, is enslaved by his desires, constantly maneuvering to get what he wants and avoid what he fears. And we can see this in Seneca's own life. As he accumulated more wealth and power, he became less free, more constrained by political obligations, more fearful of losing what he had, more compromised in his choices. The Seneca who was exiled to Corsica, stripped of his possessions, was in some ways freer than the Seneca who advised emperors and owned estates. Not because poverty is inherently better than wealth, but because poverty forced him to confront his desires and discover he could survive without fulfilling them. This is the value of voluntary discomfort, of deliberately putting yourself in situations where you don't get what you want. It's not about suffering for its own sake. It's about building the muscle of being okay with not okay. About discovering that you're more resilient than you think, that you need less than you believe, that your happiness doesn't depend on things being a certain way. Try it yourself. Go a day without something you think you need. Maybe it's coffee, maybe it's checking your phone, maybe it's a particular food or comfort. Notice what happens. At first, there's discomfort, maybe irritation. You really want the thing you're denying yourself. But as the day progresses, something shifts. You realize you're okay without it. Life continues. You function. The sky doesn't fall. And when you return to having that thing, you appreciate it more, but you also know, viscerally, that you don't need it. It's a preference, not a necessity. This knowledge is powerful because it reduces fear. If you know you can be okay without something, you're less afraid of losing it. And reduced fear means increased freedom. You make better choices when you're not afraid. You're more generous, more honest, more willing to take reasonable risks. Because you know that even if things don't work out, you'll be okay. Seneca practiced this mentally, even when he couldn't practice it physically. In his letters, he constantly returns to what Stoics called negative visualization, imagining loss. What if you lost your wealth? What if your children died? What if you lost your position, your health, your life? Not to create anxiety, but to prepare, to realize that you could survive these losses, that your core self would remain intact, that the things you think you couldn't live without aren't actually necessary for life or even for happiness. This might sound morbid or pessimistic, but it's actually the opposite. It's radical acceptance of reality. Things change, people die, circumstances shift. Fortune is genuinely unpredictable. You could have everything today and nothing tomorrow. This is just reality. The question is whether you face this reality with fear and denial or with acceptance and preparation. Seneca chose preparation. By imagining loss, by rehearsing it, by even practicing it voluntarily, he was trying to become immune to fortune's changes. And this immunity is the ultimate wealth. If you're not afraid of losing things, you can enjoy them without anxiety. If you don't need specific outcomes, you can engage with life without desperation. If your happiness doesn't depend on circumstances, you're free in a way that no amount of external wealth can provide. This is what Seneca meant when he wrote that true wealth is wanting nothing. It's not about having nothing. It's about needing nothing, about being psychologically complete and self-sufficient regardless of what you have or don't have. But let's address the elephant in the room. Seneca died rich. He didn't give away his wealth. He didn't live as an ascetic. He enjoyed luxury, used his resources, maintained his properties. So how do we reconcile this with his philosophy? Was he just rationalizing his own failure to live his ideals? Or is there something more complex happening? I think the key is in understanding what Seneca was actually advocating for. He wasn't saying everyone should be poor. He wasn't arguing for some kind of universal asceticism. What he was saying is that wealth is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used well or poorly. The problem isn't having wealth. The problem is needing it, being attached to it, letting it control your choices and compromise your virtue. A Stoic can be rich, can even pursue wealth, as long as they maintain the right relationship to it. Wealth should serve you, not the other way around. You should be the master, it should be the servant. And the way you maintain this relationship is through constant practice, through repeatedly proving to yourself that you could lose it all and be okay, through making choices based on virtue rather than on protecting your wealth. Did Seneca succeed in this? Probably not completely. His compromises with Nero, his aggressive lending practices, his inability to retire when he wanted to, these all suggest someone who was more attached to his wealth and position than he wanted to be. But the fact that he was trying, that he was constantly examining this, that he was writing about the struggle, that matters. Perfect consistency between philosophy and practice is maybe impossible for humans. What's possible is the constant effort to close that gap, to live a little more in accordance with what you know to be true. And this is actually the most valuable lesson from Seneca's life. Not that he achieved some perfect state of philosophical enlightenment, but that he kept trying despite his failures. He kept examining his desires, kept questioning his attachments, kept practicing his principles even when he fell short of them. The letters to Lucilius are effectively a record of this ongoing practice, this daily recommitment to values that he struggled to fully embody. This makes Seneca's philosophy more accessible, not less, because most of us aren't going to achieve perfect freedom from desire. We're not going to eliminate all attachment to outcomes. We're not going to become completely indifferent to what fortune brings us, but we can practice. We can reduce our unnecessary wants. We can build resilience against loss. We can make our happiness less dependent on circumstances. We can choose virtue over comfort when we're capable of it, even if we're not always capable of it. And the practices Seneca recommends are actually doable. Spend a few days eating simply, wear rough clothes, sleep uncomfortably, see what it's like to have less. When you make decisions, pause and ask, am I choosing this because it's right, or because I'm afraid of losing something? Am I pursuing this because it matters, or because everyone else thinks it's valuable? Is this desire natural and limited, or is it a bottomless pit that will never be satisfied? These questions create space between stimulus and response, between wanting and acting on that want. And in that space, you can choose differently. You can recognize that most of what you think you need, you don't actually need. That most of what you fear losing, you could survive without. That the happiness you're pursuing through accumulation won't actually be found there. This is the wisdom Seneca extracted from a life of contradiction. He got what the world says we should want: wealth, power, influence, luxury. And from that position, he could definitively say, this isn't it. This isn't what makes life good. This isn't what brings peace. The more he accumulated, the more complicated life became, the more he had to protect, the more compromises he had to make. The wealth that was supposed to buy freedom created a more subtle prison. True freedom, he discovered, comes from the opposite direction. Not from having more, but from wanting less. Not from accumulating, but from letting go. Not from protecting what you have, but from being okay with whatever happens to it. This is hard to hear in a culture built on consumption and growth and more. It contradicts everything we've been taught about success and achievement, but that doesn't make it less true. The question is whether we're brave enough to test it, to actually practice wanting less, to rehearse loss, to see what happens when we stop chasing the next thing and appreciate what's already here, to discover whether Seneca was right, that the path to wealth runs through wanting nothing. Because if he was right, and I suspect he was, then we're all pursuing happiness in exactly the wrong direction. We're running away from the destination thinking it's back where we started. We're becoming poorer the more we accumulate because every new possession is another thing to fear losing, another complexity to manage, another distance between us and simple contentment. Seneca's death, for all its messiness, proved his final point. In the end, you lose everything anyway. The wealth, the status, the possessions, the body itself, all of it goes. The only question is whether you spend your life terrified of this inevitable loss, or whether you practice letting go, over and over, until death is just one more thing you don't need to control, until the only thing that matters is how you face it. The only possession worth having is dignity in the face of whatever comes. This is why his letters survived while his estates dispersed. This is why his ideas outlived his empire. This is why 2,000 years later, we're still reading his words and finding them relevant. Because the psychology of desire hasn't changed. The trap of thinking more will finally be enough hasn't changed. The suffering that comes from constantly wanting what we don't have hasn't changed. And the freedom that comes from wanting nothing, from being content with what is, that hasn't changed either. So here we are, at the end of our journey through Seneca's life and philosophy, back where we started, the paradox of the wealthy man who taught poverty. And maybe now we can see that it wasn't hypocrisy, so much as a necessary experience. Maybe you need to have wealth to really understand its limitations. Maybe you need to climb the mountain of accumulation to discover there's nothing at the top. Maybe the best teachers of contentment are those who've pursued its opposite and found it empty. Seneca's legacy isn't his estates or his influence or his political maneuvering. It's his honest examination of the human struggle with desire. It's his detailed analysis of how wanting works, why it never satisfies, how it traps us. It's his practical recommendations for building immunity to fortune's changes. It's his example of someone who knew the truth but struggled to live it, who kept trying anyway, who left behind a record of that struggle that we can learn from. The wealth of wanting nothing isn't about being poor. It's not about denial or asceticism or suffering. It's about the profound peace that comes when you stop needing things to be different than they are, when you can enjoy wealth without clinging to it, appreciate comfort without depending on it, pursue goals without making your happiness contingent on achieving them, when the only thing you truly need is within your control, your own virtue, your own choices, your own response to whatever life brings. This is the radical freedom Seneca pointed toward. This is the wealth that can't be taken away, can't be lost to fortune, can't be destroyed by emperors or circumstances or death itself. This is what remains when everything else is stripped away. And the beautiful thing is, you don't have to wait for loss to discover it. You can practice it now. You can start letting go now. You can begin the journey from wanting everything to needing nothing, from being enslaved by desires to being freed by their absence. That's Seneca's gift to us across 2 millennia, the map of a territory he explored but never fully conquered, the honest account of a struggle we all share, the invitation to practice a freedom that's always available if we're brave enough to stop wanting. Not brave enough to have nothing, but brave enough to need nothing. Not brave enough to lose everything, but brave enough to be okay with losing anything. Not brave enough to die poor, but brave enough to live free. And maybe that's the final lesson from his contradictory life. Perfect consistency is impossible, but the practice is still worthwhile. You don't have to be a perfect Stoic to benefit from Stoic practices. You don't have to eliminate all desire to reduce destructive desires. You don't have to become wealthy to understand wealth's limitations, though it might help. You just have to be willing to examine your wants, question your needs, and practice being okay with less. That practice is available to anyone, right now. Set aside a day. Live simply. Eat simple food. Wear simple clothes. See what it's like to want nothing beyond what you have in this moment. Notice what happens. Notice the discomfort, but also notice how you survive it, how life continues, how you're okay. And then, when you return to your normal life, notice how much you have that you didn't even appreciate before. Notice how wealth you already possess becomes visible when you practice poverty. This is Seneca's prescription for the modern world. Still relevant, still powerful, still mostly ignored. Because it's hard, because it goes against everything our culture teaches, because facing our desires and realizing most of them are unnecessary and unsatisfiable is uncomfortable, because the freedom that comes from wanting nothing feels like death to an ego built on wanting everything. But it's not death, it's life, real life. Freed from the constant distraction of unfulfilled wanting. It's the peace that comes from being complete, not because you have everything, but because you need nothing. It's the wealth of wanting nothing, which is worth more than all the riches in the empire. This is what Seneca knew, what he tried to live, what he ultimately died trying to teach us. So as we close, I'll leave you with his words and an invitation. The words are from his letter to Lucilius. If you live according to nature, you will never be poor. If you live according to opinion, you will never be rich. The invitation is to test this yourself. Pick one day this week. Live simply. Want nothing. See what happens. Not as a permanent lifestyle, just as an experiment. Rehearse poverty for a day. Practice being okay with less. Build immunity to the fear of not having enough. And if you find even a taste of the freedom Seneca described, if you discover that you need less than you thought, that you're more resilient than you believed, that your happiness doesn't depend on things being a certain way, then maybe you'll understand why a dying man who owned estates across the empire spent his final hours teaching that true wealth is wanting nothing, because he'd learned it the hard way, through experience, through failure, through the painful discovery that getting everything you want leaves you wanting still. True wealth is having no desires, not because you've satisfied them all, but because you've seen through them, because you've recognized that the game of wanting is rigged, that satisfaction is always just out of reach, that the promise of fulfillment through acquisition is a lie we've been sold. True wealth is the freedom from that game, the peace of being complete right now, with exactly what you have, which is enough because you've stopped needing more. That's Seneca's dangerous truth, the one that threatens every economy built on manufactured desire, every system that depends on people never being satisfied. And it's available to you right now, if you're willing to stop wanting and start being, if you're willing to let go of the future you think you need and embrace the present you have, if you're willing to practice the poverty of desire and discover the wealth of contentment. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Seneca's life and philosophy. If you found this exploration valuable, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Your support helps us create more content diving deep into ancient wisdom that's still relevant today. And if you're feeling inspired, I challenge you to actually try Seneca's practice. Pick a day, live simply, want nothing. Then come back and share your experience in the comments. What did you discover? What was harder than expected? What surprised you? Let's continue this conversation about the wealth of wanting nothing and see if we can learn together what Seneca died trying to teach. Sweet dreams, and may you find the freedom that comes not from having everything, but from needing nothing.